everyone. Hope you've been able to have a good week this week. Obviously, lots of serious things going on in the world right now, but for 20 minutes here on this channel, I'm going to pretend none of that exists and instead concentrate on retro Sega video games. Even bad ones. Today's video is about Klax. Klax is a puzzle game released by Tengen on the Genesis in December of 1990, and it's based on an arcade game from Atari that was released 6 months prior in June. Klax, being a puzzle game with relatively low system requirements, ended up being ported to a massive amount of home computers and consoles, and holds the answer to the trivia question, what was the last official game released for the Atari 2600 in Europe? Seriously, it got ported to everything, even machines that supported only 2 and 4 colors, which was kind of important considering that the whole game is based around matching 10 different color tiles. In those cases, players had to match tiles with different patterns on them rather than colors necessarily, and it worked somewhat. In addition to the multiple port madness of the game, it even had not one but 2 different ports to the Mega Drive Genesis platform. Yes, you heard that right. In Japan, Namco worked on a port for the Mega Drive and released it, but Tengen elected to create their own version, which would be released in the United States and Europe. The versions of the game are similar, but Namco's version has a more involved 2-player competitive mode, whereas the Tengen version offers more options to the player. On the home consoles and computers, Klax was marketed as an arcade hit, but I think that might be pushing things a little bit. I certainly don't remember seeing Klax in the arcades, or playing it for that matter. Galloping Ghost here in Brookfield, Illinois supposedly has it, so maybe next time I'm in there I'll try to give it a look. Without spoiling too much of the review, both versions of Klax on the Genesis Mega Drive look pretty similar to the arcade version. And there's a good reason for that, as the arcade version of Klax runs on a board with a Motorola 68000 clocked at 7.16 MHz. And as I hope you're aware, the Genesis main CPU is a Motorola 68000 as well, but clocked slightly higher at 7.16 MHz. Other things on the arcade board differ, and the screen resolution is slightly different, but still, it's pretty unusual for the Genesis to be more powerful than the arcade hardware that was for the game. However, porting a game over from platform to platform requires a lot more than just simply horsepower. Even with enough CPU cycles to get the job done, the programmers would need to make sure the game is redrawn correctly, the sound effects are translated well, especially in the case of the Genesis, which relies on FM synthesis, and the controls should be nice and tight, accurately reflecting the on-screen action. So, how did Tengen do, being provided a proper canvas in which to paint? Were they able to create a game that accurately reflected the arcade version and that compared favorably with the previous Namco port? Or did they take the lazy way out and just create a quick cash grab, knowing that they didn't have to compete with the likes of Tetris? And beyond all of that, arcade or no, is Klax any good as a game itself, and is it worth the time in which a world where columns and Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine exist? Well, let's find out. But first, a quick look at the package.
So this is Klax, and this is one of those titles that, for better or worse, you're gonna recognize across the room as soon as you see the cover. Yikes. This is a rough cover, and it's shared with the Game Boy and NES versions. Even the Atari 2600 cover was much more impressive than this. Europe got a different cover featuring a kid playing the arcade game, which we'll see when we get to the Master System version in about 100 episodes. And Namco's Japanese cover was much better. I'll insert it here real quick for comparison's sake. So, where this art came from with the odd-looking pink hand in a K shape for Klax, and background littered with Klax pieces, I'll never know. This is one of those times when just because something is recognizable doesn't make it good. It reminds me of the art by Keith Haring, which if you're not familiar with in 2020 makes sense, as he's unfortunately been dead for 30 years, but do a Google search and you'll probably be like, oh yeah, that guy. Moving on from the eyesore that is the cover, the actual case itself is in good shape and has an intact hang tab, no tears or scratches in the plastic, and the inner cover is fully intact as well, with no corner tearing or sun bleaching or anything like that. And as much as I don't care for the cover, I do like the design on the spine with the Tengen logo, the Klax logo, and the Genesis logo all properly spaced and proportioned. Flipping over the back, and with as much as they got wrong on the front cover, the back actually looks pretty good. Being a Tengen game, the Klax rear cover resembles what we saw previously with Hard Driving in episode 43. I like the overall design here, and the catchphrase at the top, so you've got quick hands, but how fast is your brain, is pretty good. Having the rear cover background be solid white is a good choice and makes everything pop off the page and easy to read. Included amongst the flavor text in the middle of the page are 4 okay quality screenshots. Go ahead and zoom in on a few of those there. That actually would be better, but it appears that whatever monitor they were using to take the pictures from had some serious horizontal hold issues. I mean, you're not going to be able to see it from this video, but if you look at it in person, you can kind of see how wavy it is. But regardless, they're colorful and show about as much variety as you can get in a puzzle game, including a shot of the 2-player mode right there. Opening the case up, we've got the cartridge in good shape, and the manual in pretty decent shape as well. A few bends in the upper corner here, but other than that, nothing major. The manual is pretty small. Only 3 sheets of paper stapled together. And that's to be expected, as we'll get to in the review, because the game is pretty simple. But the manual does explain the game thoroughly, and I really like the section that explains the different type of Klax. And shows like how much points they're worth and how to make them, and it's really nice to have these pictures to explain things. Okay, and that's it with the physical package. Let's get to the game itself and see if I can fill out another 12 minutes. Spoiler alert. Yeah, I don't know. It's gonna be tough.
So, Klax. What can I say about Klax? Well, let's talk a little more about the time period. While Tetris dates back to the mid-80s originally on PC, it was famous for having 2 different versions appear on the NES, one from Klax's publishers Tengen and one from Nintendo. Where Tetris really blew up was with its release on the Game Boy, where it served as the packing game with the system and quickly turned the Game Boy into a must-own gadget. The Game Boy certainly was not the most advanced piece of technology in the world, featuring only a black and white screen that was susceptible to poor visibility issues due to its lack of a backlit screen. But Tetris was the perfect game for the Legend console, combining simple-to-control gameplay with graphics that didn't require lots of animation and that could be displayed in black and white with little drawback. As a result, the portable gaming market was completely redefined by Nintendo's success with the Game Boy, and Nintendo became the de facto king of portable gaming, with everyone else trying to replicate and compete with Nintendo's success with Tetris. Tetris' early popularity was due to simply being different than what had come before as far as puzzle games were concerned. Tetris combined the puzzle game genres of thinking man sensibilities with arcade-styled high-score action. It was a deceptively simple formula that caused the creation of plenty of other attempts to imitate Nintendo and Tetris' success, including Nintendo's own Dr. Mario. Enter Klax. Atari, in the swan song of their arcade heyday, had previously had success with the arcade version of Tetris. In America anyway, as we saw in Zilog and Moto episode 35, Tetris was released by Sega in arcades in Japan. However, when Atari went to release their version of Tetris on the NES with their Tengen brand, Nintendo sued, claiming that while Atari had arcade rights to the game, that did not extend to home consoles. Atari instead chose to pursue another puzzle title that they could own outright, and worked with programmers Dave Akers and Mark Stephen Pierce to release Klax in the arcades as a follow-up of sorts to Tetris. Atari even went the full Tetris on Game Boy route with one of the better ports of Klax to the Atari Lynx, and it did sell well for a Lynx game, but that's kind of like saying that a Big Mac is good for a McDonald's hamburger.
if you have a choice, you're probably getting your burger somewhere else. As mentioned earlier, Klax was ported to an obscene number of other consoles and home computers along with the Lynx port, including more than a few that it simply should not have appeared on, but that's pretty normal for a title that had a modicum of success, and that, due to its simple nature, would be easy to create on alternate platforms. At the time of release, the most modern platform that Klax appeared on was the Sega Genesis, although I'll take an argument for the Amiga or Atari ST over the Genesis. And the Genesis was certainly up to the challenge of recreating the fairly simple arcade game. Klax consists of a diagonally slanted board that points downward towards the bottom of the screen, and then a reservoir down below, rather than a game like Tetris or Dr. Mario that's a purely vertical game board. The overall net effect is that there are still tiles or pieces flowing from the top of the screen, eventually landing at the bottom, but breaking the game into two playfield sections is a nice, original idea, and it does serve to at least distance Klax from other puzzle game titles and give it less of a copycat feel. Another wrinkle in Klax is there's two ways to lose at a level. In other puzzle games, the basic concept is to try to keep the screen clear of tiles or pieces by maneuvering to match up said tiles or pieces, eliminating them from the game board and scoring points in the process. This applies in Klax as well. In the reservoir at the bottom of the screen is where the player tries to match up said tiles, and if the player is unable to match up enough tiles to keep the reservoir empty, the player will lose the level. Pretty straightforward, right? Well, the player is also responsible for catching each and every tile as it comes down the board toward the reservoir. The tiles slowly walk down the board toward the reservoir like a slinky moving down an inclined plane. Once caught, the player can either throw the tile back up onto the board, where it'll have to be caught again, or the player can hold onto the tile and carry a maximum of 5 tiles at once, or finally the player can safely drop the tile down to the reservoir in an attempt to match the tiles and patterns. But if the player does not catch the tile as it's coming off the bottom of the board, it will fall to its death at the bottom of the reservoir. By default, if a player allows 3 tiles to die by not catching them, the player will fail the level as well. And in an added twist, tile deaths are carried over from level to level. So depending on how you performed on a previous level, you may have very little room for error. So what's the overall point of Klax? Well, to beat the game, of course. And Klax can be beaten. It's not just an exercise in playing through levels over and over again in an attempt to set a high score. For those who enjoy puzzle games and learn the mechanics of Klax well enough, the game offers 100 levels to frenetically pass through before reaching the end. Personally, I wouldn't ever make it through that type of gauntlet. I'm just not that good at puzzle games. But I appreciate having a definite beginning and end to give something for the fans of the genre to try to achieve, rather than just aimless high score rankings. Also, in another twist to the game, and this is something that relates back to its arcade roots, the player isn't required to simply just beat 100 levels in a row back to back. As you play the game, every 5 levels you're given an option to warp ahead either 5 or 10 levels. If you choose the option to warp ahead 5 levels, you get an extra tile drop and 100,000 points bonus for finishing the level, and if you warp ahead 10 levels, you get 2 extra tile drops and a 200,000 point bonus. If you're good at the game, these warp options are no-brainers, but if you're not, I could definitely see potentially screwing yourself and putting you in a position where you're very quickly over your head. The Genesis version specifically gives a few configuration options for the player as they attempt to make their way through the game. You can pick a base difficulty level of easy, medium, or hard, and then whether the difficulty ramps up, i.e. the game gets harder the better you do. You can also choose the amount of continues you get, and even choose between 3 sets of base colors for the tiles. I had the biggest problem telling the dark green tiles from the light green tiles, and unfortunately there was no variation on those available in the color sets, but still, it was nice for them to think of this as an option. There's even an option to turn on background music in the game, which the arcade version doesn't have, instead relying on a wide variety of sound effect samples. But the music supplied in-game is pretty lame, so they probably could have skipped this option. As most people won't be making it to level 100, the high score table takes a higher level of importance. And one thing that I appreciate about the score list is that it fully details the difficulty level that the player is playing, and if difficulty ramping was turned on or not. Now, the game doesn't feature any sort of battery backup, so as soon as you power off your console, the high score table is wiped. but if you were competing in some sort of high score competition by screenshots, there's no faking how you got to that score. The control in Klax is incredibly simple, as you would expect from a puzzle game. All of the standard Genesis controller buttons, A, B, and C, all function the same and either drop the tile down into the reservoir after catching it, or if you're pressing up on the controller, throw the tile back up onto the platform to eventually re-drop. While pressing left or right on the D-pad positions your tile holder on the belt in one of 5 spots. One issue I ran into when I was playing the game is that your tile catcher can blend in with the screen behind it, and there were a few times when I was playing off feel while watching the tiles come down the playfield, and ended up being one position off of catching the tiles that came off the platform. This is a minor complaint, and I'm sure the more I played the game, the less of an issue this would be, but it is something that I ran into. Graphically, as stated before, Klax doesn't require a high-performance console to properly recreate, because the original arcade version wasn't very high-end to begin with. The Genesis version isn't what you would call a pixel-perfect recreation of the arcade machine, but even though it's not a 1-to-1 Xerox copy, it's as good as any of the other ports of the 16-bit era, and the game comes across to home users as authentic. Having said that, the graphics in the game are fairly plain, and you can tell the game was primarily designed by just 2 people. I do like how the background graphics change every set of 5 levels, as it provides some much needed variety to the game. One note, however, is that one of the additional game options Tengen provides is a widescreen version, which doesn't present the game in a different format, but it does stretch the game board to take up more of the screen. However, this mode stretches out everything, not just the game board. So, for instance, the high score section at the top of the screen is cut off if you use this mode. It's not a big deal, and players that just want to focus on having a better view of gameplay won't care, but it's definitely a noticeable flaw. As I mentioned before, even in the arcade version, the lack of background music is pretty shocking. This same presentation is translated over the Genesis, and the game actually makes no noise at all when it's running in demo mode, making you question whether your speakers are connected and turned on. There was a bit of background music added to the game that can be turned on, but honestly, it's nothing special, and you're better off leaving it turned off and either experience the game as it was originally intended, or perhaps supplying your own music from another source. What the arcade version did feature was a significant amount of digitized sound effects that would play throughout the game, depending on your in-game actions. The Genesis version does a good job of recreating those sound effects in-game, and while I don't think all of them made the trip over, and the ones that did are just slightly lower quality, the overall ambiance is the same. All in all, I'm giving Klax 2 stars. However, if you are a puzzle game fan, go ahead and make it 3 stars, as the game is more for you than it is for me. Puzzle games don't need to be overly complicated or ornate to be effective, but the other side of that coin is that they tend to not be overly complicated or ornate, and that's definitely what we have here. The game feels and plays just like it was developed by 2 guys in their basement, which it largely is what it is. And there's nothing wrong with that necessarily, but when compared to a major release on the Genesis, this is just a little hard to get excited about. Also, remember I gave the version of Tetris included on the Genesis Mini 2 stars as well, so I believe I'm being more than fair. There's just simply not enough here to try to keep me involved or entice me to become a Klax master.
Okay, that was Klax. Klax also appeared for the Master System in Europe, because of course it did, so we'll be looking at that version too in about 100 episodes or so. I can't complain too much about the game because it is an authentic arcade port, but this is just an arcade game that I would never play in the first place, because I'd be too busy with Final Fight or Raiden. Tune in next week when I'll be reviewing a game that I technically don't have in my possession yet, but it's supposed to get here tomorrow, so hopefully it does. It is not a puzzle game, and instead comes from the highly competitive airline simulator strategy game genre. Okay, maybe that's a stretch, but this is a thing that exists with at least 2 titles that I'm aware of on the Genesis. I'll admit, it definitely doesn't sound like my type of game, but who knows, maybe it'll be a nice surprise and I'll really get into it, and then go invest a bunch of money on Delta. Who am I kidding? I don't have any money to invest. Remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.